Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to NUPI's Cybersecurity Center webinar, the first of the kind we have this year. Today we're going to talk about emerging technologies and the implication for security and warfare. And we had a great pleasure to have Dr. Jean-Marc Rickli with us. And he is head of the Global Risk and Resilience at the Geneva Center for Security Policy in Geneva. He has a great CV on relevant topics. I will mention some highlights from his bio. He's a research fellow at King's College in London. He's an advisor on the AI initiative of the Future Society that used to be affiliated with the Harvard Kennedy School. He's an expert on autonomous weapons for United Nations working group, and also co-chair of NATO Partnership for Peace Consortium on Emerging Security Challenges and working group. He has also been an assistant professor at King's College, based in Doha, and he has published. He has a PhD from Oxford and has published a recent book called Surrogate Warfare: The Transformation of War in the 21st Century. So this is a great speaker. We are looking forward to hear his views. Now, following Dr. Rickli, we will have 5 minutes comments from a colleague at NUPI, Erik Reichborn-Kjennerud, who is an expert on military targeting and security technologies. After that, we will open for Q&A. So you can start writing your questions right away during the presentations. I will read and collect them and then post them at the end of the event. But you can start writing right away. And if you see some questions that you like, you can press the like button, and the most popular questions will be asked first. So there we go. So with no further ado, I'll pass now the microphone over to Jean-Marc. He will talk for about 25 minutes or so. So Jean-Marc, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, NUPI, for the kind invitation. And yeah. Just start my slideshow. Can you see my slide? Yeah, it's good. Yes. All right, good. So what I do is trying to think about the security implication about artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. And this is basically what I'll try to convey to you in the next 20-25 minutes, how to think about AI and already observable implications, security implication of AI, and maybe some way forward. So AI is nothing new. It's a term that was coined in the mid-50s by a group of a researcher, and by one of these, researcher John McCarthy. He defines AI as the ability of making a machine behave in ways that would be called intelligence if a human were so behaving. And so there has been lots of definition as well as academic struggle on what is intelligence, what is artificial intelligence. I don't want to dig into that. What I do is I adopt a more pragmatic view, looking at where we are now, and whether you can qualify that as AI or not is another debate. Some people talk about weak AI. This is what you have in your mobile phone, like Siri, to what we call artificial general intelligence and super intelligence. This is a state where basically artificial entity would surpass human cognition and human analytical capabilities. I don't want to dig into that. I'm just looking at where we are now and what are already security implications. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, more slow tells you that computing power of your computer double every 18 months. So the CPU, the central processing unit, if you want, of the computers have been put into this graph, which is a logarithmic graph. And what we see here is a very linear relationship, which means that this Moore's law is in a way validated because very strong linear relation. That means that computing power doubles every 18 months. So for AI to work, you need two things. You need computing power as well as data. At the same time, what we see since the last 15 years now is an explosion of data. Maybe look at what American consume in terms of gigabyte every minute at the bottom right, 2.6, and bear this figure in mind. That was what was consumed every minute in 2017. I will return to that in a few seconds. So we are producing more and more data, and this trend will probably just increase because of the so-called Internet of Things. So the ability to connect not just computers, but devices that become intelligent. It could be anything from a fridge to a car to your home. And so on this graph, it is estimated that we'll reach around 50 billion connected devices by 2050. Some said that figure will already be reached by 2030. Now, remember the amount of data we consume in 2017. Look now at the same, the bottom right, the same amount has almost doubled in 2 years. This means that basically we are producing an increasing amount of data, and these data are not neutral, as you'll see in a minute. Currently, it is estimated that we produce 2.5 exabytes of data, which is the equivalent of 250,000 libraries of Congress. So in terms of AI, for a long time, there were no much breakthroughs, but around the mid-2010, suddenly you had a few. You might have heard about AlphaGo. The game of Go is the most complex game, a board game that is out there. It has 10 to the power of 170 possibilities. And so in 2016, an algorithm developed by Google's AI arms, which is DeepMind, played against the second best Go player in the world. And out of 5 games, AlphaGo won 4 times. And through other iteration, then AlphaGo 0 was developed a few months later. That basically defeated AlphaGo 100-0, and in December 2017, AlphaZero was developed and learned to play the game of Go, shogi, a Japanese equivalent of chess, and the game of chess, and acquire superhuman capabilities in 36 hours, starting from no knowledge about the game. That's why it was called AlphaZero. At the same time, you had a different approach in AI that does not rely on deep learning and reinforced learning that was developed by Carnegie Mellon University, and they train an algorithm to play the game of Texas Hold'em in limited poker. And after 150,000 hands over a month, the algorithm won against 4 the best player in the world, and the human player that lost the least lost $80,000. The one that lost the most, $800,000. Why the algorithm made 1.5 million in gain. That was even more breakthrough than AlphaGo, because here basically the game of poker, unlike AlphaGo, is not limited because of the ability of cheating. It opens the possibilities to infinite. And so here, what is interesting is that you have an algorithm that has learned how to cheat, and that has learned how to cheat in a random way, because otherwise, if you have a cheating pattern in poker, a professional player would pick you up. So this graph shows you here a measure, if you want, of the complexity of games. And the game of Go, as I told you, is 10 to the power 170. For you to understand what this figure means, it is estimated that in the universe we have 10 to the power of 80 atoms in the universe. And then, but you have more complex games than that, especially those games that are played online. StarCraft 2, for instance, has a state complexity factor of 10 to the power of 1,685. And it was two of the best players at that game were actually defeated in January last year. So if you look at the state complexity factor and you're defeated, you can see that there is, in terms of complexity, an exponential growth, but in terms of the time now for to defeat the humans at this game, we can see that it is shrinking. And in a way, that was it is because computing power has evolved. This graph that was published on a blog post of OpenAI shows you that until 2012, it shows you the amount of compute needed to solve a few problems. And so here you can see the first part on the left is basically akin to Moore's law, doubling every 2 months. Whereas from 2012, the doubling period is going down to 3 to 3.5 months, which means that from 2012 to 2018, the amount of compute of your computing capacity through the Moore's law would have evolved by a factor of 12. But because of AI, it has evolved by a factor of 300,000. So 300,000 times more powerful. And so these growth are displaying exponential growth. And if we look at the digital domain, we can see that growth patterns in that domain are really defined by exponential growth. It is estimated that this year, a computer will have the computing power of a human brain, and by 2045, if this growth continues, then we should have a chip that is worth $1,000 that would have a computing power of all human brains. Obviously, there are limitations to this growth, one being energy, because the more this algorithm become powerful, the more energy they consume. And this energy consumption is also exponential. But what it means for application is that if we are confronted with an exponential growth, and whereas we are actually thinking in linear term because we are wired to think in linear term, it means that the more time passes, the more irrelevant we are becoming, because the delta between what you think happened and what happened is widening on a constant basis. So probably most of you know this game, the Rubik's Cube. The Rubik's Cubes have 43 quintillion possibilities. So 43 followed by 18 0. And so the human record at this game was to solve it in about 3.54 seconds. Some people at MIT developed an algorithm to play this game, and this is what happened.
Solving in 3, 2, 1.
Oh dear.
So what you can see here is that this game was solved in 0.38 seconds. Why? Because basically, even though you have 43 quintillion possibilities, if you want, any game set could be solved in 20 moves. And basically, the algorithm was able to identify which pattern to use and solve it in 20 moves. So what does that mean for you? It means that if you are making your living out of earning money on Rubik's Cube, if you put it against an algorithm these days, you probably get out of job. And you say, well, if it's a Rubik's Cube, that's fine. But what we are seeing increasingly is that more and more tasks are automatized. Here you have an example of an algorithm that was developed to do dog fighting, and it was pitted against in a simulator against a Top Gun instructor. And as you can read his feeling after this dog fight, basically he lost any encounter against the algorithm, and it was as if the algorithm knew already what it was about to do, and basically was able to preempt his future moves. So in terms of clear already security implications and in terms of exponential growth, a very good example is what we call deepfake. Deepfakes are videos that are digital media that are taken and basically fused with another one. And here what you see is the first deepfake video that was published on Reddit in early December 2017. What you see here is a scene of a porn movie, but the face of the actress is not the real the real actress. It's Gaudi Godat, a Israeli actress. And so here on this video, if you watch it carefully, you can see there are some hesitation at especially when she turns ahead. And so people at the time were asked, how long will it take to democratize this technology? And experts in AI said, well, probably 1 to 2 years. 2 months later, in January 2018, this video was uploaded, and again, a deepfake video from a porn movie, and this time this is not the actress, but this is Jessica Alba. And on this one, basically, you can no longer see any kind of hesitation. And those who have done this video also developed the application Fake App that anyone can download. So once that process was unleashed, there has been consequences. For instance, here, if you look at these faces, what they have in common is that none of the person that you see here are real. They have all been generated artificially by an artificial intelligence that was fed with a data set that represented celebrities, and the algorithm came up with faces of celebrities. This technology that's being used for deepfakes, called generative adversarial networks, has been developed in 2014. And if you look at development over the years, you see that by 2018, you can no longer see that the picture is not a real picture or doesn't look like a real picture. And so this has consequences. One of the first reports on the state of deepfakes was published last year by a company called Deeptrace. And they look at how many videos were on the web. They found that there were almost 15,000. That was September last year. So since then, the number have increased. About 15,000 videos that had been viewed by 134 million people, but 96% of these videos were pornographic videos, that basically deepfakes in pornography. And among these 96%, all the victims of these deepfakes were women. So here you can see a direct implication on human security, individual security, targeting especially women. The remaining 4% were policymakers and celebrities. But this has also implication in defense. Some are estimate that China could actually use deepfakes to deepfake satellite pictures by adding or removing features on satellite pictures. An experiment was conducted a year ago by a researcher in Tel Aviv that hacked an imagery center, MRI imagery center. Used deepfakes, GAN technology to produce deepfakes by adding or removing tumor, and then these MRI pictures were shown to radiologists, and 100% of the radiologists were fooled by this manipulation. So studies recently acknowledge or find out that basically there is an asymmetry between truth and lies, that lies spread much more faster than truth, and reach much more people than truth as well. So with deepfake, many people will tell you, I only believe what I see. With deepfakes, now you really have to challenge this assumption because it's no longer the case. So I guess that some of you are using fitness trackers. Some of them are running an application called Strava. Strava released a few 2 years ago its hot map on its user. You can identify where most Strava users are located, but only by looking at on internet less than 24 hours after this hot map were published, I could basically find very interesting analysis. So here what you see is a building, and it's the Pentagon, and you can see that there are probably tunnels underneath the Pentagon. This is a French secret military base in Madama, in Niger, because basically a soldier had Strava, and basically they were recorded their position. This is probably a tunnel in the middle of a mountain in Afghanistan. This is the CIA outpost in Mogadishu in Somalia. This is the Turkish guard patterns in Manbij in Syria, and this is an Italian pilot that had let its profile open, and what you can see is which unit it belongs to and where he is. So what is my point here? My point is that, as I mentioned earlier, the data that we're producing are not neutral, and increasingly more and more of these data are being used, and if they are basically cross-fertilized, they could you can infer a lot of information. Amazon, for instance, has launched a series of equipment that are working with Alexa. When Amazon first launched its connected microwave, it was the best sell on Amazon 2 years ago, and last year they developed a new oven that is also connected. But by having all these connected devices, what you do, you create data, and these data can be used. And one country that has understood very well how to use this data is China, that has developed an extensive system of social control, where basically people are assigned a value, and depending on the activities that you're doing, this value can go up and down, and below a specific threshold, you're preventing from traveling or from having access to certain services. But it's not only China. I mean, each of us is a potential victim of this. It's my case, my personal experience, where, you know, Facebook on 2 occasions last year sent me notification from people that had uploaded pictures of me on Facebook, and I didn't know these people. I was in countries that I never been before, and basically the algorithm of Facebook has identified my face and already know exactly how I am looking like. So for Facebook, I have no longer any secrets. Why is it a problem? Because obviously privacy reason. And earlier or last year, you have a startup company called Clearview that basically developed an algorithm that is able to identify anyone in the world by basically uploading pictures that you can find on social media. More than 3 billion pictures are in the data set. The FBI data set only have 400 million pictures. And so a private entrepreneur developed this application where you can basically snap a picture of anyone in the street, run it through this application, and then you will know everything that is online about this person. The problem is that this database was hacked in February, and obviously the data are out. Another potential use of artificial intelligence is through swarms. So you might have seen these pictures of drones that are used to replace fireworks. The world record is 2018 drones that were flown at the same time in 2018 by Intel. But in the military, increasingly there are some thinking about using swarms of drones. So swarm is the idea of overwhelming and saturating an adversary defense system by using mass firepower and the concentration of forces. So we have started to see military applications of swarms. For instance, during the Battle of Mosul, ISIS was using drones, and not in a real swarm. We're not autonomous, but still they were using mass and firepower, and some up to 30 Iraqi soldiers lost their life on a weekly basis against ISIS drones. This was the first time that a non-state actor acquired tactical air superiority, and since then we have seen more and more examples of this. The most dramatic one was probably last year's attack on Saudi Aramco, a combination of drones and cruise missiles that led to a drop of 5% of the world production overnight. So,
strikes last year. We're super proud of it. It allows you to separate the bad guys from the good. It's a big deal. But we have something much bigger. Your kids probably have one of these, right? Not quite. Hell of a pilot? No. That skill is all AI. It's flying itself. Its processor can react 100 times faster than a human. The stochastic motion is an anti-sniper feature. Just like any mobile device these days, it has cameras and sensors, and just like your phones and social media apps, it does facial recognition. Inside here is 3 grams of shaped explosive. This is how it works. Did you see that? That little bang is enough to penetrate the skull and destroy the contents. They used to say guns don't kill people.
Right. So I guess that behind your screen, most of you are terrified if you haven't seen this video before. It's called Slaughterbot, and I want to reassure you, this is a fictional video that was produced by a advocacy group called Ban Killer Robots, and the idea was to raise awareness about possible uses of artificial intelligence. That is the good news. The bad news is that all the technology that is displaying this technology exists already, and basically just a matter of time before this could be achieved. In that slide, what you see in the middle is an experiment that was conducted by Armasis, the Swiss equivalent of DARPA, where a kilogram of shaped explosive on any scales, even with a helmet, is lethal in 100% of the time. But this is reality, and basically what we see are increasingly development in the weaponization of drones. In the middle, you have a flying AK-47 advertised as being a weapon to counter drones, anti-drone weapon. The latest is the one at the bottom right, which is a Cargo 2 drone, a Turkish drone that is advertised as having swarming capabilities and autonomous facial recognition capabilities. I doubt they are there, but still, the fact that people are talking about that is a sign that research is being conducting in this field. So these are development in non-state actors, if you want, things that you can find off the shelf, but also in terms of great powers, there is almost an arms race that began when probably this study was published that recognized the future of autonomy, so the use of artificial intelligence to develop collective intelligence. And so the message of this report was clear. It was to invest into this technology to remain ahead of adversary. And since then, we have seen China and Russia and other great powers investing heavily in that type of research to potentially develop autonomous weapon systems. Are weapons that are able to select the target on their own and basically to independently compose and select the different courses of action to reach the objective. Research has been conducted. Here, this is also a U.S. Air Force research where 103 drones were launched from F-18. They were assigned 4 missions, and after the mission, basically autonomously, they regrouped and waited for further instruction. The U.S. Air Force is looking to have its first experiment next year, where you have an aircraft that is piloted by AI being pitted against an aircraft piloted with a human being. But these application of AI is not just in the physical domain. Probably the most likely development of, if we get there, to autonomous weapons system will be in the cyber domain. In 2018, IBM DeepLocker was developed, was a proof of concept. It was a malware equipped with a neural network that was able to identify a person and basically unload its payload when it identified the person behind a computer. So here you have a first trial, if you want, experiment of using machine learning for malware, and this will probably be a game changer in cyber security. So if we get there to autonomous weapons system, this will probably have impact on strategic stability, and debate is still open. My argument is that it will probably favor the offensive over the defensive, and if that is the case, then against in an offensive environment, the only way to defend yourself is to attack first, and therefore preemption will become a norm, and this has the consequences of favoring arms races, as well as lowering the threshold of the use of force. And it's also, preemption is also a violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. Increasingly, we have research now on AI and weapons of mass destruction. Last year, you had a bunch of columns in the US that were arguing for equipping command and control center for nuclear weapons with AI in order to be much faster. I mean, lots of people reacted very negatively against this thing, and some people are now thinking about should we consider swarms of autonomous drone swarm as weapons of mass destruction. So slightly this debate is coming to the fore. Behind that, and it's the idea that technology increasingly becomes surrogate thanks to artificial intelligence, and warfare in the 21st century is increasingly waged by using surrogates, by both states and non-state actors using human and or a technological surrogate. So for those who studied strategic studies, you have the so-called Trinitarian model of warfare by Clausewitz, that basically was composed of government, citizen, and armed forces fighting against government, citizens, and armed forces. With surrogate warfare, because surrogates allows a less important footprint, provides a plausible deniability. The link between the armed forces and citizen is lost, and citizens also have less to say about government actions, and so this also facilitates the use of force. Technology plays a very important role here, because basically it allows government to replace human beings with technology. I will finish by looking at two aspects. One is what is maybe different from the past is the speed of proliferation, both horizontally and vertically, so among states and across from state to non-state actors. I take here the example of 3D printing. This was the first 3D printed gun back in 2011. The plans were developed by a young American libertarian, and then he released the codes on an internet, and then afterward what you saw is a proliferation of weapons that could be 3D printed by sometimes 3D printing specific parts. This is the first fully 3D printed gun. And last year, you might remember, there was a terror attack in Halle in Germany, and the guy who conducted this attack had 3D printed that gun. It was not used during this, the attack against the synagogue in Halle, but it was recovered at his home and in his car. So basically, once something has been translated into codes and the codes are out, there's almost no way you can stop proliferation. The last point I want to mention is convergence. Basically, what we see is not just artificial intelligence, but it's 5 technology, synthetic biology, quantum computing, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, and neurosciences. And more what we see are cross-fertilization between these different technologies. For instance, here you have an experiment 2015 where a sensor were put on scales of a quadriplegic woman. She couldn't move any part of her body, and after half an hour of training, she could fly the latest fighter aircraft, F-35 aircraft, just by thinking about flying the aircraft. So this has translated into military doctrine, potential military doctrine, that increasingly will merge human and the machine through human-machine teaming. And you may have heard about the loyal wingman concept, the idea that one pilot helped by artificial intelligence could actually be responsible for entire squadrons of fighters. This concept is embedded in this Skyborg plans, which is basically exactly that. And the US Air Force has just launched a competition to basically develop Skyborg. So here you can see interesting development where the militaries are also reaching out to the private sector to help to develop that kind of technology. So to conclude, emerging technologies are, for now, characterized by an exponential growth, and both in development. So it is costly. Very often, it's very costly to develop this technology. But once they are developed, the prices also drop very rapidly. And what we see is, as I mentioned earlier, a very quick vertical and horizontal proliferation to states, to non-state actors, and to other actors. This is helped by the data explosion and increasingly the translation of physical activities into digital activities. This has the potential to empower non-state actors, individual and some states. And what we see is that not every state are equal when it comes to access to this technology. Probably, if you look at the geopolitics of AI, you only have two states that are calling the shots. This is China and the US. And in between, basically, you pretty much have no one, not even the Europeans. And so it means that technology will increasingly be used as a surrogate because technology will allow more and more autonomy in the future. If that is the case, and we are moving to a more and more autonomous weapon system, it is likely that we will shift the offense-defense balance towards the offensive, and that will mean a much more conflictual international environment. And in order to forestall this development, we need to invest in a global governance of emerging technologies, because we have to embed in this system norms and rules to prevent malicious uses. But it's very, very difficult. So if you have any question, you can reach out to me through these different email addresses and Twitter account. And just to say that all what I said today is what we also teach at our Center, Geneva Center for Security Policy, and you can see our different courses online, gcsp.ch. And I stop here.
Okay. Thank you, Jean-Marc. Now I will. It was great and fascinating and scary at the same time. I don't know what would be the best way to describe it. As I said, I will now pass the floor to Erik Reichborn-Kjennerud. He's at NUPI. He will give some comments in 5 minutes, and then we'll engage with the Q&A. So, Erik, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a really interesting talk, and I must say also deeply unsettling. And it shows a lot of how technologies, while possible to use for good things, are also used for malicious activities. I think I would like to just comment on a few things that I think are interesting. In terms of AI, you said that you talked about the AlphaGo and the poker system that was developed, and I think that it's very interesting that you picked up on the poker system, which is much more, I guess, sophisticated and closer to kind of human behavior and social complexity than both chess and Go. Although that being said, there's a long-standing idea, at least in the West, that war is very much reducible to a game of chess, and very much of the military theory that's been taught around the West is developed to kind of manage, control, and also calculate the battlefield, which is a very reductive view of war, I guess. So I mean, and I think that tendency, you see that also in at least some of the military publications that talk about uses of AI, and it's very much focused on the battlefield rather than war as a kind of a social phenomenon. That of course makes it much more calculable, although as we've seen over the past 2 decades, it's very difficult to. There's a huge difference between the battlefield and actually winning a war. On the case on offensive and defensive, whether or not that whole balance will be upended by these new systems. I think that's a fascinating discussion. I think that some people would say that there are still a lot of defensive systems like electromagnetic pulse, jamming, these sorts of things. But so I think that more interestingly maybe is how governments and militaries themselves see this shift, whether the balance is there or not. And it seems to me, as you alluded to, that if people are starting to view the offensive as much more powerful than the defense, that might lead to rash decisions. And when we talk about rash decisions, we talk about minutes now rather than hours. So, and especially if you, as you said, the talk about connecting these command and control systems that already have been established with regards to nuclear weapons. If you put autonomous machine learning systems into these, we're in for a much more scary world. We already know that these command and control and radar systems that were used during the Cold War was full of problems and both human and machinic error. But luckily, we didn't have a nuclear war at that time. And that, I guess, points me to my last comment, and then that you ended up with as well, and that's the question of control and governance of these technologies. And I think that's probably the most important question regarding new technologies is how do we govern these? And I'm a little bit unsettled by what the American military calls the Terminator dilemma. Basically, what do we do if the others develop these kind of killer robots, or what you want to call them? And their conclusion seems to be that they just have to develop them themselves, and then of course that leads to other states having have to develop these systems as well. And I think that there's a lot of work that has to be done on how to kind of stop that kind of logic and not let it be spiraling out of control. And when we talk about control, I think that there are 2 points of this. We talk about humans having to be in control of machines, but that also is a question of whether or not, or whether machines and humans can actually be separated. We can say that in the end that humans are the ones that pushes the buttons, but if all the information about whether or not to push that button is rendered by machines, and there is either no time or impossible to actually find out how the machines came to that conclusion, it really questions whether or not, you know, humans are in control or not. And if it is so that we are making decisions based on computer generated information and knowledge, I think that we have to kind of reevaluate what control means. And I think I'll stop with that, and then we can do some Q&A. Or if you, Mark, you want to reply.
Yes, Jean-Marc, I'll give the opportunity to reply to Erik briefly, and before we engage with the Q&A. Okay?
Yeah. So yeah, lots of good points you raised, Erik. I think the same as you, Libertas. The algorithm that was developed to play the game of poker is much more breakthrough than AlphaGo, although it received much less social visibility, because basically here we have been able to develop an algorithm that is mimicking human behavior, and this is a kind of a transformative. Now about your vision, the American vision about, and the military about the use of AI on the battlefield, which is very much based on this idea of producing kinetic effect for coercive purposes. Well, if you look at the Chinese vision of the use of AI, is much less in kinetics. They are developing also that kind of system, but they are also looking at the way you can weaponize information and the way AI could be used to weaponize information. And here, this is a very different paradigm in which you enter, which is non-kinetic. On the offense-defense balance, the jury is out, that's for sure. Yes, you do have EMP, electromagnetic pulse weapons, but in a way that would be the weapon of last resort, because if you detonate an EMP, you basically grill any electronic system and you back almost to the Stone Age. So do you really want to do that? That's a question mark is open. The question is which side between the offensive and defensive will win. And the reason why my argument is that the offensive will win is because if we look at what happened in the digital domain, basically the offensive has already won. On a daily basis, you have millions of cyber attacks, and yes, you might have antivirus and different softwares to help you to fight that, but this software will be as good as the last attack. And so we've seen that with AI, you could be able to engineer new ways to find vulnerabilities. The issue of perception is very important, and you're right. Some people will tell you, I mean, we are so far away from understanding the human brain. Don't talk about artificial intelligence. There is nothing like artificial intelligence. That might be correct, but the fact that people are perceiving that autonomy will be the silver bullet 21st century is leading to an arms race, and therefore controlling perception will be probably as much important, if not more important, than the actual development in weapons system. And the reason being that in nuclear deterrence, the idea was to communicate on your capabilities in order to show your adversary what capabilities you had in order to prevent him from attacking you. In the digital domain, it's exactly the opposite, because if you communicate about your digital capabilities, you are also communicating about your weaknesses and loopholes. Therefore, there is a price in non-communication, and if you don't communicate, this will only make a perception worsen the perception. And finally, on the issue of human control, what you refer to is probably what we call meaningful human control. These are discussions that are taking place in Geneva within the framework of the CCW conference, the Conference on Conventional weapons, and one specifically based on lethal autonomous weapons system. And after now 6 years of talks, the states have come up with a 11 guiding principle, and one has to do with we should be able to keep meaningful human control in any weapons system in the future. The problem is, how do you define meaningful human control? Because if the entire decision making is done by an algorithm, at the end you have a human operator that use its finger to press on the fire button. Is it still a human control or not? And a really good study was published a few days ago by CIPRI, by Vincent Balana and his team on exactly these issues. So I really recommend the viewers to have a look at this study about human control.
Thank you so much. So let's now continue with some Q&A question, and I also kind of mix in my own questions here. And I would like to start at your last point on the global governments. You just mentioned the process going on in UN, and also that was on your main point towards the end, that we're seeing a more conflictual international politics, but so we need more global governance. But of course, it's difficult to regulate. But some of the questions also asking at why hasn't more been done also on a national level? It's not everything that is impossible to regulate, is it? There was this example here from one question about, for instance, on deepfakes. Why aren't we seeing government taking stronger stance on specific technical innovations? Is it because, and that's another question I kind of mixing them up a little bit, is that it's so technically difficult that it's difficult for policymakers to actually keep track and make correct or effective legislation? What's your take on that?
Right. So here you have, so it's about the global level of governance, the national level, and a specific example of deepfakes. At the global level, what you have to understand is that unlike nuclear weapons that were developed by states, suddenly you had a state decided to gather a bunch of scientists in a desert and basically make them work to develop nuclear weapons. These technology, being in artificial intelligence, in synthetic biology, in neurotechnologies, quantum computing, the most important pushes and progress are being done in the private sector. So it's very difficult to regulate what is being done in the private sector unless it violates, specific national rules. So as states are no longer in the driving seat, although some states are actually pushing for innovation, and the Chinese government, for instance, have a very strong link with the private sector. The American military is reaching out to Silicon Valley, for instance, to get ideas and about technological developments. Here you have a mismatch between who are calling the shots and who decides. And if you look at the UN is a collective security organization that reflects, if you want, the geopolitical structure of 1945, the post-Second World War peace settlement. Since then, time have passed, so the geopolitical structure is no longer the same in terms of who are the main players, but also you have these non-state actors and multinational companies. If you take Facebook, which claims to have 2.4 or 2.5 billion users, it's twice the number of citizens of China. All right. So here suddenly you have this mastodont, this huge company that has a footprint in every country in the world, almost, and he is by itself having an influence on the way people consume information, the way people interact, and define in a way or influence people as behavior. Now, in terms of national regulation, yes, you have some pushes by states to regulate at a national level, but these issues are transnational by nature. And if you took, for instance, GDPR, the European attempt to protect privacy, GDPR works in Europe, but beyond Europe, states do not feel bound by this regulation. So here you also have to understand that you have very different perspective when it comes, for instance, to data privacy. In Europe, we are very much about protecting privacy and confidentiality, whereas if you go to Asia and China, they have a very different stance on this. Now, about deepfakes. I use the example of deepfakes to illustrate how fast this technology evolves. December 2017, first, 2014, generative adversarial networks, this technology, GAN, is developed at a theoretical level. December 2017, you have the first application of deepfakes in the video, and less than 2 years later, you see the commercialization of this technology, because as soon as you have one of these technology that is made accessible to anyone, you have an ecosystem that develops. You can find a website where you can download deepfakes, where you can send for a few $1,000. You can ask a company to create a specific deepfake. So in less than 18 months, suddenly you have this tidal wave of deepfakes that have been developed. The problem is that the development is exponential, but the way government works is very much linear. So first, for policymakers to understand what deepfakes are all about, I can tell you firsthand, because starting in February 2018, so when I saw this video, I started to lecture on this, and I also gave brief to different member of parliaments and governments in Europe. And the problem I faced was that when you talk about cyber, because cyber is difficult to see, it's impossible to see. They have already problems to understand cyber and cybersecurity. Now, when you talk about autonomy and artificial intelligence, most of them were thinking, okay, you're talking about science fiction, So for them to integrate the security implication, it's almost impossible, because what you have to do is foresight exercises. So global governance needs to develop and integrate a multi-stakeholders approach, which is not just states, but the scientific community. And here the question also about whether all scientific discovery should be published, because there are a few now technologies or technological developments that have very strong security implication. I give you the example in biotechnology, synthetic biology. A few months ago, a paper was published in an academic journal about giving the recipe to synthesize horsepox, which is a disease that only affects horses, but it's a cousin to smallpox. And smallpox has been eradicated, but killed more individuals than all the war in the 20th century. And so basically now you have the recipe of how to synthesize horsepox, a cousin of smallpox, in an open academic journal. So there is also some thinking to make about the communication of a scientific discovery. So the scientific community has to get involved, but also companies. The problem is companies are very reluctant also to get involved in this. And so we have to engineer new ways to adapt global governance to the reality of the 21st century.
Right, thank you. Follow up on that, you mentioned that Facebook has more citizens than China, so to speak. And if you look at the world globally, you have a couple of big states like China and US that have access to large amounts of data, which is of course maybe the main currency. Lots of these developments, it's having a big data, and you have these companies, a handful of companies. Are we seeing kind of a world splitting into kind of two in a way? It's like though the has and has-nots. So the big ones, some states, maybe only two, and the big companies, big tech, and the rest of us, small states like Switzerland and Norway. We're not going to be able to to keep track, neither on in regular security regulation or in defense terms. Is this a way to look at it?
Well, you raise a point of the geopolitics of artificial intelligence and emerging tech, which is absolutely fascinating. And here is a paradox. I mean, Europe is the continent that is producing the most engineers in artificial intelligence, the most research on artificial intelligence. But when it comes to applications, you see that there are only two poles. This is the United States and China. So the attractive power of especially the United States for European is very important. And it has to do because these big 5 companies, Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, are dominating the market because it's almost, the digital market is almost always characterized by a winner takes all approach. You know, the reason why Uber, people are investing in Uber, whereas Uber is not making any profit, is that those investors know that if Uber win the race against competitors like Lyft and others, they will win the pot. And then they will generate a lot of revenues. That has happened to Facebook, to Amazon's and others. And so you end up in a situation where if you look at the wealthiest people in the world, and now all these people that are in the tech industries, Bezos, Musk, and others, so they generate a lot of profits. And this effect has been compounded by the coronavirus crisis, where traditional businesses are going down, and you see the revenues of these companies going up even more because people have shifted to digital tools. So they have financial power that no other companies have, and also no states have. That's very attractive. So they have data that no one else has. And so when you're a young PhD or a young engineer, if you have to choose between an academic career and being hired by this company, your salary might be 5-10 times higher if you are being hired by Facebook. The best engineer I've heard are being paid up to 150 million a year, as well as you have access to data you will never have access to. All right, so it's very powerful. So now the question is, to what extent is it possible to have other actors entering the market? It's almost impossible. Why? Because if you have a very good idea and you develop your own startup companies, what most of these companies will do is 2 things. One, they can try to buy you back, okay, and integrate yourself, your company in the group, like WhatsApp, for instance, or they have the means to develop internally a team that will compete with you. And basically, because they have this structural advantage, it's almost impossible for you to compete. So even though, to return to your question, you have these 2 very important poles that attracts almost everything that is around. So what remains for other states is not much. It doesn't mean that they have lost the race, but it means that to dictate the market, it's almost too late. At least in that space, there might be new emerging technologies, but you have to think ahead about what will be the next thing where you can invest. The recipe are always the same. You need a very strong ecosystem composed of venture capitalists, so people willing to take risks to invest in companies, entrepreneur, education, and when you have that, and also rules that allows entrepreneurship. And the US compared to Europe is much more gives much more freedom for entrepreneur than in Europe. So we might have to rethink also the rules here, the legislation in Europe when it comes to favoring entrepreneurship. But the problem is that if you want to compete, if your goal is to create the next Facebook, I mean, forget it.
Right. Let's move on to the defense sector. Traditionally, when new technologies have emerged, they have been, to begin with, they have been integrated into existing organizations, and after a while, the technology has created new organization like the Air Force, right? Initially, it was you know it was part of a regular of the army, and then it became part of it became a standalone military organization. And you mentioned swarming, which is you know is a military theory from long time back about the kind of different kind of tactics, but it's different from a conventional military way of doing things. So my question is, with all these emerging technologies, do you think we will see kind of completely, we'll see that the end of brigades and battleships and of course dogfights in the air? I guess it's already a question, but how revolutionary will this be also for military organization in your view?
It's also a very good question. So swarming, I would say that swarming will not be conventional. It will be conventional. It will use different operating mode. You know, if you look at development of the use of force, you can basically highlight 4 principles. This is punishment, interdiction, risk, and decapitation. And swarming will be the 5th. By using, you know, mass firepower and mobility. It could lead to unconventional weapons if you equip it with weapons of mass destruction, but that would be a different question. But the question that you raise is the question of mass. Do we still require mass to generate effect? And basically, if you look at AI and this emerging technology, they are characterized by scalability. You know, it might be very expensive to develop a specific application or a specific algorithm, but once the codes are out, the codes are out. Take an example of Stuxnet, which was, if you want, the first some called cyber weapon that was probably developed by Israel and the US to attack Iranian centrifuges in Natanz. And so this malware basically increased the rotation speed of centrifuges while the operator was seeing on its screen that everything was going all right. If you look nowadays on the internet for the codes, I mean, you can find, you know, website where you have the codes. Most of them will have removed the malicious codes, you know, but it's still out there. So once you have that, you can basically replicate or reverse engineer what the Iranian did, and by launching then other attack called Shamoon and others. And so people can reverse engineer, but they can also be creative. And there is the case of this young American students who developed a botnet that no longer was relying. So a botnet takes hostage your computer, and you give an instruction to the botnet, and it will, for instance, log onto a website. And if you have taken, you know, 50,000 computers hostage, then you will have suddenly 50,000 requests for logging on a website, and it will crash down. And so you have these college kids that were playing Minecraft, and they were hosting a local server, and they wanted to make more money. And so instead of improving the system, they decided, okay, what if we attack competing server, we redirect the traffic towards ours, and so we will increase the money we're making. And they developed a botnet that was not, unlike traditional botnet, focusing on computers, but on connected devices. And so the attack surface suddenly increased dramatically because there are much more connected devices than computers. And so they were able to launch attack, which I think up to 600,000 devices, which is enormous. And they were generating $100,000 a month, up until they realized that they were starting to raise red flags, and they released the codes on the internet, and through different iteration, other actors then use these codes to attack a company, Condé, that translates your HTTP address into IP address. And it almost broke down the traffic between Northern America and Europe in internet. The point I'm making here is that because of scalability, you only have to have a few individuals, if engineered well, could have a dramatic impact, and that for traditional military, it's very difficult to take into account, because suddenly your traditional vulnerabilities are no longer what they used to be, and you have to think completely in different ways. You can be vulnerable. There has been more and more instances where, as I show you with Strava, for instance, where the type of information, the slides I showed you earlier, 40 years ago, that would have been highly classified and part of an intelligence service. Nowadays, it's online. Okay, so you have to completely think in different way about the way you can use information. And most people will tell you, well, I don't care about, if people know my position. But the problem is that if you start to have data about your position and then about your eating habits, your holidays habits or whatever, you can start to reconstitute, how the psychological profile of the person, and then this kind of information can be used and could be weaponized if it falls into the hands of the wrong actors. I mean, we already saw that in 2016 with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, but that was just the tip of the iceberg, because there were no artificial intelligence systems that were used into that. But think about similar system that could be automatized. This could have tremendous implication.
Thank you. I will now, let's see, there's a few questions here on the feed which I haven't passed on to you. So I will start with on the top here, which is, you mentioned Stuxnet and Israel, because the question here says, how can we learn cybersecurity from Israel? I understand they have they are really leading in this era.
How can we, sorry, what?
Learn cybersecurity from Israel. Since you work in the Middle East, do you have any expertise on Israeli cybersecurity?
Well, it's a big topic. I mean, to link it with a question you had earlier about small states, having a hedge. I mean, the Israeli have a very specific ecosystem, and the ecosystem is based on the integration of the military and the civilian domain. The military is 3 years, and so people are creating bonds, and most of the time, what you see is that out of the military, you have spin-offs of company that are created and are then used in the commercial sector. And the Israeli have learned the hard way in 2006 when they were at war with Hezbollah, because Hezbollah won the information war. Even though the Israeli had much higher military capabilities, the Hezbollah shifted the battlefield into the information domain, and they depicted the Israeli operation as being illegitimate. And the Israeli won that, lost that war. They learned from their mistake and invested heavily into that. And so Stuxnet, there is absolutely no confirmation that it was engineered by the Americans and the Israeli, but those who have conducted studies on that, there are lots of information pointing towards the states. So to return to Israel, Israel is an important actor in the cyber domain, but even Israel and Israeli companies do not have the same footprint as American or Chinese companies because of the size. The advantage of the Chinese is that if you have a Chinese company developing a product, they potentially already have 1.2 billion individuals. And what matters in artificial intelligence is data. So they can generate a lot of data. And the Chinese have studied like this. And what they do, once you have trained your algorithm towards specific data that are in China, then once you have your algorithm, then you can use it elsewhere. That's what the Chinese are currently doing, trying to export some of the algorithm, sometimes for free, but in return they have they have proprietary data, so they own the data, and this happens in African countries and also in countries in Europe.
Thank you. So I'll take another question from the feed here, okay, which is a little bit different, because it's a question from an early mid-career researcher who asked, what are the most useful way to engage in this space? as practitioners on the low-level technology or at the high-level policy level? So I guess it's a question of what to study. Should we study the technological level or the political level, if I understand the question correctly?
Well, the response is simple. If you want to make money, study engineering. Become an engineer, machine learning or data science, and you want to have problems to find a job, and you probably make a lot of money. If you want to be to have a more global outlook, then yeah, you can study the policy, and there are lots of policy issues that will need to be solved. We mentioned earlier global governance. This is still not solved. What we've so basically, as I mentioned earlier, around 2012, 13, 14, there was this new era of AI because of machine learning and deep learning technology, and people have become much more interested in this. In terms of the governance, what we've seen is that states were late in that game, most of them, with a few exceptions. But suddenly you have companies now trying to, especially when AI started to have bad press around 2015, this company realized that it could have an impact. If when Elon Musk said that basically AI could have tremendous negative impact, this had an impact on the perspective of the general public on AI, and in fine, a general a negative implication for the business of this technology. So these big companies pulled their forces together, developed, set up a few institutions, also in order to promote a better vision of artificial intelligence, as well as pushing for legislations that are in line with basically the commercial interest. And what is interesting here is that you have two logics. You have those who are developing the technology that are motivated by commercial interest, and then you have states who have less access to these technologies, but they are in charge of public good and in charge of a global governance. And so the commercial interest most of the time does not align with the interest of states. If you look into the cyber domain, for instance, most of the application or the devices that are using digital technologies are not developed with security in mind. That's why you receive on a weekly basis updates on your computers, And so because security by design is not embedded in development of these technologies, then we end up with lots of problems. And these companies will only start to dig into that when it starts to have negative impact on the market.
Then, of course, it's a bit late. Yeah. Erik, I would like to invite you to. You've been listening for a while, and you can either ask a question to Jean-Marc or comment what's been said.
No, I think the discussion has been really interesting, and I mean. There's so much to take in here. I mean, there's so many different ways that these new technologies can be used for malicious activity. I mean, you mentioned also synthetic biology, which is very problematic as well, and can, of course. I mean, once you said that once the technology is out there, I mean, there's likelihood for individuals to develop synthetic viruses and things like that, which no humans have antibodies of. So I mean, we can go into. I mean, you can only use your imagination in the ways that these can be used for malicious activities. But I think I wanted to go back to the way that the difference between how the Western militaries and especially the Chinese view on the war and warfare works. I mean, it seems to me that we are mostly concerned about this in developing kinetic weapons, as you said, and then I guess my question is whether warfare will look very differently. I mean, do we actually need kinetic weapons to conduct warfare, or call it whatever you want. The political competition, right? So you can, I mean, if you can harm another state in ways that are non-kinetic, and it seems to me that a lot of these new technologies are enabling that rather than just enabling a better kinetic precision, faster warfare, right?
Yeah, so two things. First, about the malicious usage of emerging tech. My point is not to say that these technologies are bad. No. My point is to say that there will be, or there are already, tremendous progresses thanks to these technologies in healthcare and elsewhere. And if you look at the way AI was used, for instance, during the coronavirus, to sequence the virus, and then also to improve research, these are all very good implications. The point I'm trying to make is that we have to be careful, exactly because of what you mentioned, because of the ease at which this technology can proliferate once it is out. So the second point, which is, I think, will be a question that will determine, strategic studies in this century, because you're right. I mean, our vision has always been, and it dates back to the Roman Empire and even before, using force in a little way, kinetically, to force your adversaries to do what you want. And since the early 2000s, 2010s, even the end of the 90s, a book was published in China called Unrestricted Warfare, I think 1998, where we have these two Chinese colonels who are arguing that in the future there's no point in trying to defeat the West on its term, which is through a traditional conventional military operation, but we need to look at center of gravities and weaknesses of the democracies, and center of gravities are public opinion. What binds together a country, the trust, the social contract. And so by using information, weaponizing information, you can basically deceive or weaken your adversary. This is also at the core of the Russian use of forces. I mean, General Gerasimov is famous for his quotes on the future of force, or the way he is using force. 80% is information, 20% is kinetic. I mean, for immediate and for medium term, there will always be a combination of both, because at the end of the day, if you have the threat of being bombed and being physically destroyed, this is still a very powerful tool to raise your negotiating position. But what we're seeing is that we are no longer facing, or increasingly less so, open war. Okay, what we see are actions below the threshold of warfare. If you look at what happens in Crimea, or in eastern Ukraine, you don't have a direct display of force, and so it prevents you from retaliating, but at the same time you are heavily incapacitated, because your information domain is being targeted. And I think that the lessons for any actors in the future that want to compete with the West is to look at these weaknesses, and the thing is that it's no longer just states that are able to have that; it's also non-state actors. If you look at ISIS, ISIS was the first organization who understood the power of social media as force multiplier. And the way what they did was to combine the use of ultra-violence, all these decapitation videos, by the virality of the spread on social media. And so if you look at how ISIS used this to conquer in less than 6 months the size of the UK, that is quite formidable with 60, 70,000 people. So here again, you see an integration between the kinetic and non-kinetic dimension, and because it's much less expensive to invest into that, and much more pervasive, because through information you can have access to the entire globe, whereas when you use kinetic force, you are bounded by physical limitation. I mean, we will see more and more of that in the future, and that leads us to think, especially the states and other organizations, about how resilient we are. How can we actually make our societies much more resilient to that kind of attack? And this is a challenge that we are facing right now.
Yes, thank you. Resilience is of course a key word these days. If it was as easy as it's easier said than done, isn't it? I think we'll wrap up there. We're almost at the end anyway. So I think I've addressed all the questions that came in the live feed. So I will conclude by thank you so much, Jean-Marc, for sharing your thoughts and insight with us. It's been really interesting and very useful and scary at the same time. But it is obviously some topics we all need to keep an eye on if you want to understand our societies and the new security risks and warfare in more general. Thank you also to Erik for your comments and views here, and for all the viewers. I hope you have enjoyed it, and see you next time. Thank you very much and goodbye.